In 1972, the US government thought John Lennon was trying to overthrow America. They didn't see him as a former Beatle or a songwriter, but as a threat. His phone was tapped, his post was opened, and his movements were tracked. So how did it come to this? How did one of the world's most beloved musicians become an enemy of the state? Let's get into the full story of John Lennon versus the FBI. By 1971, John Lennon had left the Beatles. He was done being a pop star and he was ready to become a serious artist, hell-bent on political change. He and Yoko Ono moved to New York City, looking for a new start. They rented a small apartment near the West Village, and they quickly became New Yorkers. To John, New York felt alive in a way that London never did. "This is where I belong," he told his friends. "I feel at home here."
I can be a human being in New York, which I can't be in many other cities.
But Lennon had no idea that his new home was about to turn on him. You see, America wasn't exactly at peace. The Vietnam War was dragging on and the country was divided. Young people were marching in the streets, demanding change and calling for an end to the war. And Lennon decided that he couldn't just watch from the sidelines.
I think all our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. You know, and I think that's what I sussed when I was 16 and 12 way down the line. But I expressed it differently all through my life.
He'd always wanted to be a part of something. He'd always wanted to use his fame to do something real. Together with Yoko, he'd staged a series of bed-ins for peace, inviting the media into their hotel room while they sat in bed. They were clear publicity stunts, but John and Yoko knew exactly what they were doing. Every camera that showed up was another chance to spread their message. And then came the song "Give Peace a Chance." Recorded in a hotel room, it was rough and messy, but it still caught fire. Because it's a brilliant song, and it's helped by the fact that it's so simple and so easy to sing along to. Now, protesters across America had started chanting it at marches. Unsurprisingly, it became the anthem of the anti-war movement. Give peace a chance. So when you've got the world's most famous rock star telling people to start protesting against the establishment, well, that's when John Lennon stopped being a musician and started becoming a problem. President Richard Nixon was running for re-election in 1972, and he wasn't about to let anti-war voices ruin it for him. To Nixon, Lennon wasn't just a pop singer. He was a symbol of everything his administration feared: youth and rebellion. And Lennon's new friends didn't exactly help his cause. He'd become close with well-known activists like Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, who were leaders of the counterculture movement, who openly spoke out against Nixon and the Vietnam War. They were planning a large demonstration at the Republican National Convention that year. In order to help them, Lennon donated $75,000. If John Lennon showed up to that convention, millions of young people might too. People who might not otherwise, because, well, it's John Lennon. And say if he sang "Give Peace a Chance" on live television, right in the middle of Nixon's campaign, well, that could be catastrophic for the president. Regardless, Nixon decided to silence him. In February of 1972, the FBI officially opened a file on John Winston Lennon. It started with just a few pages, but within months, it grew into hundreds. Agents followed Lennon and Yoko through the city. They took notes on who visited them, what events they attended, and what restaurants they ate at. Their post was opened, their phone calls were tapped, and informants were planted among their friends. One FBI memo described Lennon as having considerable influence among youth and an earnest desire to use that influence for political ends. Another read, "Subject's activities should be closely monitored to determine subversive intent." Basically, it just meant keep watching him just in case. At first, Lennon didn't care. He had a great sense of humour, and he was one of the most famous people in the world. He knew he had nothing to hide. So what if they wanted to search his bins? It stopped being funny though when immigration officers showed up at his door. That March, John Lennon was told his visa was being revoked, and the official reason, well, it was a 1968 marijuana conviction in London. Now, how crazy is that? From nearly 4 years ago. In reality, it was just a political move. Nixon wanted Lennon gone before the election, which was going to be in November. As crazy as it sounds, Nixon and many of his allies were truly afraid that Lennon was preaching radical ideas through his music, and that could eventually lead to the downfall of America. Some people might be thinking, well, why didn't John and Yoko just move back to London? just get away from the stress of it all. If they weren't wanted, well, just go back. Well, Yoko couldn't leave America. She was going through a long custody battle for her daughter with her ex-husband. If she were to leave New York, she would forfeit the chance of winning her daughter back. The FBI had made it personal. They were trying to break apart his marriage. Lennon appealed, but the stress was constant. His phone rang at strange hours, and strangers lingered outside his apartment, and friends remembered him checking behind his curtains, convinced that he was being followed. He wasn't wrong. The FBI's New York office sent daily reports to Washington. They documented everything: Lennon's bank statements, his travel plans, and his private conversations. One report even noted that Lennon had purchased a new car. Like, why would they even need to know that? The investigation at times, though, could be laughable. At the time, a wanted poster emerged of John Lennon. However, it wasn't his face on the poster. They'd mistakenly used busker David Peel's face on the poster instead. Could you imagine mistaking the face of one of the most famous people in the world? At the start, Lennon refused to stop speaking out. He still appeared at anti-war rallies and charity concerts, and he gave interviews urging young people to vote for change. But the pressure started to take its toll. He grew tired, anxious, and paranoid. Yoko later said that every time the phone rang, he jumped. He was convinced they were listening, and they were. He later said it affected him when writing music. Friends began to distance themselves because they didn't want to be associated with him in case they got caught up in this investigation. Slowly, his protest stopped. Lennon withdrew from public life. The man who had once been the loudest voice of a generation began to go quiet. He went on his long weekend to Los Angeles, and his next two records, Mind Games and Walls and Bridges, weren't really political. He was tired of it all, and, well, fair enough. I just got tired of being worried. The whole immigration thing, the FBI following us, it just wears you out. I just wanted to be with Yoko and raise our son. Then, unexpectedly, he won. After 4 long years of court battles, appeals, and endless anxiety, John Lennon received his green card in 1976. The US government had lost. The deportation case was dropped. For the first time in years, John could breathe. He moved into the Dakota building with Yoko and began living quietly, and he spent time there with their young son Sean and focused on family life. The truth about how closely Lennon had been watched didn't come out until years later. In the 1980s, after countless of freedom of information requests, historians finally gained access to his FBI file. It was enormous, 281 pages of reports, memos, and interviews. Most of them were redacted in thick black ink, but even what remained was shocking. The FBI had documented every aspect of his life, from lyrics to who he'd had a beer with, all in the name of national security. John Wiener, a historian who had spent years fighting for the release of the files, said it best. They weren't afraid Lennon would start a revolution. They were afraid he'd get people to vote. And if he did, they definitely wouldn't be voting for Nixon. When the files were finally made public, they revealed what Lennon had suspected all along. He hadn't been paranoid. He'd been right. And I think as well, it's also worth noting that when Nixon was re-elected in November of 1972, that was when the FBI investigation into John Lennon stopped. But what do you think? Did John Lennon really have the power to overthrow the US government? I'd really love to speak to an older listener who was there at the time if they've got any perspective on his activism in the early 70s. And while you're at it, go check my video out on Lennon's Lost Weekend if you want to know more about his time in the early to mid 70s. As always guys, I'll see you down the road.